format you want to follow? You want to ask me some questions, just things that prompt?
Well,
Kind of
first,
helps rather than trying to just make it up as I go along. Or,
tell me first of all, who you are.
okay. You want me to do that now?
Sure.
Okay. Hi, my name is Davie Agnew. I'm from Scotland, and I spent quite a lot of my life in Lausanne, Switzerland during the 60s. And I now live in this place here, which is Teutonia, Idaho. And as you can see, I have a wonderful view to waking up to every morning, have tea in bed, and look at the Tetons.
Okay, now, why did you end up in Switzerland? How and when?
I finished up in Switzerland through a series of visits. The first one was to the Dolomites in 1961, where I was climbing. Having done a lot of climbing in Scotland, like most young Scots at that time, we wanted to go and climb in the Alps. So this friend of mine, Con Higgins, who'd climbed with quite a few famous climbers in Britain, I guess you would say. He just started climbing, and we went to the Dolomites, went through Chamonix. And on the way over, I'd heard about Lausanne, Switzerland, where my other friend, Stuart Fulton, used to live. And about a year or so later, I was traveling around Europe and decided to stop in and see Stuart. And I think that might have been, as close as I can remember, 63. I'd been through there earlier, but to actually stay there, I think, was the time. I remember it because it was the night of Kennedy's assassination. Happened during my stay there, and I didn't really know who John F. Kennedy was at the time. I knew he was the President of the United States, but that was all I really knew. And the people in Club Vagabond, which had moved up the hill to Fédé from where it was down near the Bernous, I would say that was when I really became familiar with Lausanne and the Vag, or really aware of the Vag's presence. Because before that, we kind of hung around with climbers and skiers, and really weren't that interested in hanging around in bars for the sake of bars, and we were doing our own traveling anyway. And from then on, I developed a very strong association with Lausanne, because my friend Stuart was there, and through him I was introduced to people like John Harland.
Can you hold that thought for a minute?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, that's better. One favor, I know Leighton did the same thing the other day. Mm-hmm. If you are conscious of it, try not to move the foot in the snow.
Okay.
It's me. I can hear it.
Oh, you can hear it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
So let's just start with the Kennedy assassination and then go back forward from there.
Yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, when I was staying with Stuart, that was the time that John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and I knew that because all the Americans and the Canadians who were staying at Club Vagabond at the time were very, very upset about the whole thing. And I got to say, I was pretty ignorant. I didn't know who John F. Kennedy really was, other than the President of the United States. And that's when I really became aware of the Club Vagabond and the people who had started it, like Alan Rankin and Carl and Luc van der Kay. Because at that time, we pretty much climbers kept themselves to themselves. So I stayed with climbers and skiers and didn't really go up to clubs, and it was a club to me. I had no idea what was involved with the Vag. But as I was staying there with Stuart, I ran into Dougal Haston, who'd come over from Scotland. And Dougal and I had been good friends from when we were kids. I'd known Dougal for, ever since I'd been about 15 years old. And he was a little older than I was. And anyway, he was there climbing, or trying to climb. He was living in people's basements. And he would go to the Vag occasionally. I don't think he hung out there too much in the early days, because nobody had any money. And we got together and we decided that, seeing that we were both there approximately the same time, this would be 73, 74, we started skiing. I taught him to ski quite a bit because he couldn't ski worth a hoot. And he was staying at that time in, he stayed in John Harlan's basement for a little bit, and then he stayed in the basement of this flat of a friend called Dr. Emil Boozman, de Boozman, who had a music school. He taught harpsichord and music. And I stayed in Stuart's house in the basement, which was almost next door. So we got together and we just started exploring Lausanne, doing climbs on the Sphinx, on the Tour d'Aille. And it became very apparent to us that we had basically had the whole Alps and certainly the Lausanne region to ourselves in order to pursue climbing and skiing. And I was really into ski mountaineering and also I like to climb. And so we formed a pretty strong alliance, which was really good. It was a good continuance from what we had left in Scotland. And one of the reasons we were both there from Scotland was that the weather in Scotland was so unpredictable that if you wanted to climb or do anything, it was almost impossible. You always had to fight the weather. And during vacation, from work or from, in Dougal's case, from university, it was hard to say the weather was going to be great at that time. So I had learned to ski in Scotland, and I took that skill to the Alps. And we both had learned to climb there, so we formed a pretty strong partnership. And so we started climbing around Lausanne. And Dougal, of course, was much more interested in the big faces. And so he teamed up and met John Harlan there. And this is...
All right.
And when I was there, and having running into Dougal, we both formed a partnership to go winter climbing. And there was another American climber in Lausanne at the same time called John Harlan. And this was prior to John's accident in the Eiger, and before Dougal and he became good enough friends that they formed that attempt on the direct route on the north face of the Eiger. And as there's been quite a lot done on that subject, I won't go into that too much, but and just more or less concentrate on what Dougal and I did. Well, we just started climbing all the peaks around Lausanne in winter, the various old classic climbs. We skied, and basically it was a life of Riley, and we'd go up to the Vag for a beer or two or a pint, but we weren't really strong habitués because we didn't have a lot of the money, and even in those days, drinking was bad for your health. If you drank too much, you couldn't get up the next day and go climbing, which was what we were focused on. And as things progressed, myself, in the winter of 65, 66, just before John Harlan's accident, and John getting killed that following early winter in the Eiger, I had dinner at his house with he and his family, and he'd asked me to come back and work at the School of Mountaineering, John's school, the Harlan School of Mountaineering. It might have been ISM at the time, I'm not quite sure. I know we always refer to it as ISM. And I agreed. And at the same time, I was asked to work at Lausanne American School, the high school, and run the climbing program and the ski program, which I did with Royal Robbins for the next few years. And so what happened with my complete involvement in it happened that summer in the next year when, after John was killed in the Eiger, the school was kind of up in the air. And then Don Willans took it over for a bit. And then he didn't do that great a job of running it. And so Bev asked Dougal if he would take it over. And Dougal, he and I being really good friends, basically sort of, from way back in Scotland. And he said, well, would you help me with this? Would you work with me on that? And I said, sure, let's do it. And we did. And that was basically the genesis of ISM as I know it. And this is all my take on it, my memory. And we decided to run it very much along the guidelines of what we did in Scotland when Dougal and Ellie Moriarty ran a Scottish mountaineering school, which only lasted about a summer. They didn't make much money out of it and probably drank all the profits. And so that began a really close relationship with myself and the Club Vagabond. because our base of operations was the basement of the Vagabond. We couldn't have survived in Switzerland without basements, and everybody had them. And so I always remember that first summer when we got started up, wages were almost non-existent. I think I got 100 Swiss francs a month, and Annie would provide the food. And we shared the flat. We all just chipped in, and everybody just slept where they could. I usually finished up in a closet or a boiler room or something, the living room floor, but it was cheap. and we went from there and had just phenomenal time just planning this program of climbing, where we essentially had carte blanche in the Alps. There wasn't the same bureaucratic or liability problems they have today. We would just say, well, let's go and do this, and we could go and do it, and no one objected. The biggest problem we ever had with running our courses would be in Chamonix, maybe with the climbing school there. Their international guide service would object to us running our clients on the Boson Glacier or on the M or the Vallée Blanche or wherever. And but once they got to know us, and one of the guides there, René Demazon, knew Dougal, and we'd met some of them at John Harlan's funeral, you know, through Gaston Rebuffet and Demazon and a few other guys there. They became quite accepting of us and just left us alone, didn't hassle us too much. And so that was part of our program, was to spend a couple of days in Chamonix, several days on the Grand Miroir, and then we would climb all over the Tour d'Ailly, Tour Mayenne. And the other thing we did with that particular program we created was that we had all the students who took a course learn to lead. We didn't guide them. We didn't believe in actually guiding per se, or being a sort of a means to have someone really talk about having climbed the Matterhorn or the Eiger or Mont Blanc without, you know, they had to lead it, and we would always encourage that. And I think that was the basis of our program, was to get clients, students out there. We called them students, and the students would come and we'd teach them to climb. And we did that the best way we could, which was to put them on the sharp end of the rope and point them up the cliff face, having taught them the basics to start with. It wasn't just totally, you know, as you were. Might stop a second. I just hear that.
Let me do a focus check real fast. All right, just so back to, you know, you weren't a guide service, and just go take off from there.
Okay. Well, mainly when we were running the climbing school and getting it going, we basically tried to be a climbing school, not so much a guide service. And I thought it was really terrific, because I think we were very innovative. I mean, a couple of things we would do, we would have never more than 2 students per instructor. And in the first couple of years there only were 2 instructors. There was Dougal and myself, because we didn't have any money to hire anybody else. And also in the meantime, at the time when Dougal went off to Cerratori with Mick Burke, he would take off on these expeditions, having been invited on them, and I would run the climbing school, and in which case I would hire someone else to help me. And the first person I ever hired, other than having Dougal work there, was Mike Galbraith, who now lives in Calgary. And Mike was one of the first people. He and I think it was Alan Rouse, you could check that, but they did the first British ascent of the north face of the Matterhorn. And so Mike was a good old friend, and he was one of what we call the younger Edinburgh crowd, because from our background, you know, a lot of people hadn't really started climbing. And so Mike had come over and had climbed the north face of the Matterhorn, and he was teaching mathematics at La Rosée, which was a private school out of, I think it was out of Montreux. I think it was Montreux or Lausanne, probably Montreux. I'm not quite sure on that. But Mike would work with me in the intern, and it was a terrific time. I mean, working at the Vagabond, there's a lot of stories about the Vagabond in terms of some of the characters there, a lot of drunkenness, a lot of fights, a lot of brawling, but that really didn't happen that much. It did happen, but not too often. It was pretty, because at that time in the mid-60s, there were people passing through, and you had seasons where it'd be really busy. We had a lot of Canadians and Australians and Brits, mostly Canadians, Australians, and Americans. And they were all young people traveling, so they were watching their budget. Some of them would stay and have a few beers. And then we did in the off-season have some big parties that were quite infamous. But there was a lot less of that went on than people would like to think. And, you know, my own take on it is just, it was a terrific time. Mainly because it wasn't as crowded. It wasn't as crowded as people would have thought. It would be busy seasons. And I still stay in touch with a lot of the people who work the bar, like Gary Phillips, who lives in Winthrop. Jim Collins lives there. And mainly the Vag was a sort of a center for these world travelers, these young men and women who came there and shared stories and experiences and would join up and go and have another adventure. And Jim Collins always springs to my mind as being one who was probably the luckiest guy I think I ever met. He would decide he wanted to go do something, and it all fell in place for him. Like one time he decided he was going to go to Egypt and travel down through Africa and just wander around South Africa, Rhodesia. And one day he was around the docks on the side of the Suez Canal, and a ship pulled in, and the guy asked him if he was an American, and he says, "Yeah, I'm an American." The guy said, "You know anything about ships?" And he says, "Yes, I do." He says, "You want a job?" So he got a job sailing on an oceanographic survey all the way down the east coast of Africa and up the west coast and over to South America and points beyond. And that's only one of Jim's sort of stories. He's the kind of guy who finished up in Iceland and would be walking around the docks again and join a polar expedition, you know, and it just fell in place for him. I think it was really terrific. And we had a lot of people like that. Guys like Paul Murrow, who lives in Colorado, and Paul had hiked and trekked all over western Nepal at that time when it was a very remote region. I mean, things that today's National Geographic makes big issues out of, but you'd run into people who did that thing sort of every day. You know, it was very easy for them to share stories and then cook up adventures. Go do the high route. Maybe hire us to teach them climbing. And then they would go and climb, you know, the Matterhorn. And we had another instructor who worked for us called Ole. I forget Ole's second name, but he was Danish, and he's quite a character at Lausanne later on in the 60s, in the early 70s. And he might have worked with Chick Scott, who came along later on. And we took Ole up the Eiger. We did the west face of the Eiger with some students and Mike Galbraith. And as we were climbing up there, the weather was really great when we started out at 2 o'clock in the morning from Kleine Scheidegg, and we were climbing up there. Dugald and myself as one team, one of his clients and Mike Galbraith as another team, and Ole and this guy Ray from San Francisco as the other team. And they were the kind of the least experienced, and so we really had to focus on them staying together. The rest of us were kind of soloing around. So we get to the summit of the Eiger about 9:30 in the morning, and the weather just turned to just absolute crap. You know, there's only way to explain it. You know, it was storming, it was snowing, you couldn't see. We were up there in this beautiful viewpoint, but we couldn't see anything. And then it became, like a lot of times in the Eiger, kind of a struggle for just mere existence, you know. And so we all decided to head down, and we left instructions as we were taking off and running down the hill as fast as we could, down the west face at this time. We had to abandon our other thoughts of doing the Mittelegi and going down and checking out the south face or further sorties on the mountain, we had to get off it. And we told the two younger ones, Ole and Ray, to stick together and not to do anything unroped because they weren't quite confident enough or had the experience enough to do that. And then the rest of us, it was a free-for-all. So Dougal and I took off and we were heading down the west face just as fast as we could, unroped solo. And then Mike and this other client who is now, you know, freelance, but he had been a client the week before, actually had been from Vietnam. I think he was a Green Beret or something. A lot of them used to come and take courses with us. And so we were all kind of on our own schedule. And Dougal and I were way ahead, just running down the hill. And occasionally we'd look up and catch glimpses of the other people. But it was made very clear when we started out that it was, in those days, sort of professional rules, every man for themselves, you know. It was, if you wanted to team up with somebody, that was it. But you were basically on your own. So anyway, Dougal and I went down, and this is a very, very interesting incident. We had descended the upper snowfields on the west face, right next to the north, that would be the northwest ridge actually, I think, and we were coming down. There was stuff avalanching and crashing all over, and we got down below this cliff band and we were in this little kind of ravine gully, and there was a big snow bridge on it, and we stood there and we were out of the wind and it was calm, and we stood there to get a breath and just sort of take stock of where we were. And we were standing there, and then without even saying anything or communicating, we both leapt at the same time towards the snowbank on the side, digging in our crampons and axes as the whole snowbird collapsed. And then we climbed out of there and ran down the rest of the way towards Scheideggs, towards the bar, and we had no idea what happened to everybody else above us. But we figured they'd be all right as long as they stuck together, you know. And anyway, we got back to Scheidegg, and we went to the bar then and had a good drink, a couple of beers, a couple of whiskies. And then in comes Michael Braith, and then in comes this other guy who I just forget his name for the time being, but no sign of Ole and Ray. And we were beginning to get a little bit concerned. And in those days, in Chamonix and in the Alps, all the British climbers and climbers in general, American climbers, everybody did their own rescues. They effected their own rescues. Climbers looked after themselves, looked after their own, because there really weren't any professional mountain rescue teams. It's the same in Scotland, you know. Now it's different. It's different all over the world. There's professionals everywhere you look. You know, there's groups of search and rescue and very well trained individuals. But in those days, it was just climbers. So we were getting ready to actually head back up the hill to see if there was any sign of those guys, and then eventually they showed up. And it was great because they had really listened to us when we were giving them their climbing instruction a week or so before, and they had listened to us by staying roped together, not unroping on certain steep parts. And sure enough, the story that came out of that one, that Ole got in a bit of a hurry and was trying to rush down unroped off this top snowfield on a huge slab of snow, which would be like a skateboard on a big steep slab with ball bearings underneath. And Ray said, "No, you can't do that. You know, Dougal and Davie told us we had to rope up." So reluctantly, Ole tied in. And as he stepped out on the slab of snow, the whole thing took off. But he was on belay, so he was fine. And after that, they both stuck together and they made their way down the hill and they were just fine. And there are lots of stories like that, you know, and I could go on all day about some of those things. But what we tried to teach was individual responsibility, you know, coming up with a really good game plan. Yeah. Lausanne itself is a really fascinating place. I mean, I got really interested in its location and the situation where it is situated above the Alps. The view it has, I mean, I can look at the camera and then I'm looking straight out from the Club Vagabond or where I live in my apartment balcony, or from the school balcony, or from Larry Ware's balcony. You can see the Dent du Midi, the Chamonix Alps, the you know, Col de Moss, the Chamusser, you know, looking right across the valley at the Grand Mouvement, Les Diablés, all the peaks, and you say this is a pretty special place, and how did it evolve into the sort of place that it is today? And as I lived in the town and talked to people, I found that there was a lot of sanatoria. In fact, most of the modern utilization of those buildings for the college and the school that existed there were old sanatoria. And there was a Grand Hotel, which was a hotel where they would have concerts and people would come to convalesce or visit, take the airs of the waters back in the turn of the century or during the 20s. And then I found out that someone had told me it had been part of the story for Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, which I had read, and I got kind of interested in these beautiful places, these salles d'attendance, where people went in order to wait to die, but they would die surrounded with all this beauty and serenity, and it was quite the place. And then I guess after World War II, and Europe was devastated, and so these places like Lausanne, which was not quite in the same league as Davos or Klosters or St. Moritz or Gstaad, it wasn't quite in those guys' leagues, but it was a spectacular place, and all of these buildings fell into disrepair. And I think that's why the American school and the college and the Vagabond finished up there, because there was real estate available to develop these types of facilities, educational facilities. And that's how I saw the VAG too. I saw it as an information center, a place kind of like a meeting of the water, so to speak.
The Vagabond was a meeting of the world.
Boy, there was a big hawk. That was actually a huge rough-leg hawk that just flew away over there.
No, we saw one out here the other day coming in.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's bald eagles in and around here and hawks in a whole bit. Okay.
It's a special spot you got here. It's really nice.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, your view is unbelievable. All right, back to Lausanne.
Yeah. Well, I saw Lausanne as a sort of a meeting of the waters, as a coming together of people who had just started traveling, who were interested in traveling, and through the Vagabond, or through the facility of the Vagabond, boy, some great adventures were planned. You know, great expeditions. You know, expeditions to the Himalayas, expeditions to Russia, expeditions to South Africa, all over the place. An exchange of ideas, and I would say not too unlike what I was exposed to as an apprentice in the shipyards, where I was an apprentice in John Brown Shipyards in Clydebank, big shipbuilding facility, and most of the men there had been professional soldiers and sailors all over the world, from everywhere in the world, and so I was inspired by the stories they would tell. And it was also where I got an introduction to climbing, which I believe in Scotland, the rock climbing started probably during the Depression in 1920s. In fact, my first journeyman was one of the founder members of my own club, the Craig Dew Mountaineering Club, and they would just inspire me by these stories and encourage me to get out and go walking and hiking, and then they'd introduce me to a climber. Like my first mentor in climbing world was Johnny Cunningham, who, to my mind, one of the greatest mountaineers ever lived, really. And he would take me climbing, and through them I'd meet other climbers, and we would plan expeditions and where we would go and do new climbs and explore different areas. And the Vagabond was exactly like that. And the people who founded it were travelers, and it was founded in a way to sort of supply a fairly reasonable kind of bar licensed hostel place to stay in the Swiss Alps, which even in those days was quite expensive unless you were camping. It was very hard to find any kind of hostel accommodation, especially one that was licensed. So they had this great great idea, and I'm really glad to have been a part of the Vagabond experience. And I was there for quite a long time, probably 7 or 8 years off and on. I stay between ISM and the high school to college, and even though I even worked at the Vag, I helped one summer with Paul Murrell, who's an old vagabonder. We helped remodel and rebuild Fougere, which was their second little hostelry just down the hill from the Vagabond. And that was a terrific experience. Met more people that I visited in the United States, did all kinds of interesting things. It was an eye-opening experience. It was a sort of a wellspring of ideas. Met very interesting people. Some of them are still friends of mine today, and a lot of them, unfortunately, are gone. But all in all, the Vagabond is just a great place. But you know, that was the same with Chenard's shop. It was the same with Boulder. I mean, if you wanted to come to the United States and you didn't know anything about climbing, you went to Clamp 4, you went to Schwangonks, you went to Boulder, you got in, you know, you usually went to El Dorado Canyon. And that's how you got in tabs of what was going on. There were only like 4 places in the United States that you could go if you didn't know anybody. You've one address, or even if you didn't know anybody, you could go and climb there and you would meet someone and you would get set up with a place to crash and, you know, possibly a ride somewhere. And that was the Schwangonks, Boulder, you know, because there was a lot of Brits in Boulder. Brian Robertson was there. So the Brits and the English, the Brits, especially Scots and English, always went where there was this countryman. And Chenard, because he had visited Britain in 1961, and I climbed with them, always told the guys there, you come and stay. We didn't think anybody would show up, but we did. And then there was Camp 4 in Yosemite. You see?
Yeah.
And so when you had those places, the Tetons were a little later. That wasn't until more into the 60s the Tetons became a little bit more of a center. And Jackson Hole was a real climbing center. It was a bit of a closed shop. It was still the Dartmouth Cloud and Exum and a few climbers. It didn't really come into its own until, I would say, much later into the 80s, somewhere like that.
So you live in the United States now.
Yeah, I'm a United States citizen.
You're a citizen. You met a lot of these Americans in Lausanne. Some of these American climbers who subsequently invited you to the United States.
Except for like Yvonne Chenard and Hemming. I met them in Scotland. They came to Scotland. And Robbins. I didn't meet him in Scotland, but he was in Scotland before so I knew of him before I went there. And the other ones I had met some of them I had met like in Chamonix. And some of the other climbers I'd met in the Dolomites. You see? It was very complicated. The ones that I knew in Switzerland actually were students and people who had been skiers and climbers in Lausanne, you know, like Courtney Richards, who I went and saw just a couple of years ago. He actually ran over my dog, and my dog eventually died. It was too bad. It broke his leg. But Court was there in Lausanne, you know, and then I met Ted Wilson in Lausanne, so I've known Ted a long time. Even though we don't do much, I'd just known him because those were the sort of the real highlight days of Lausanne in Switzerland, you know. You went to Schwangonks, so you went to Yosemite to Camp 4, you went to Boulder, or you took a chance and went to Chenard's shop in Ventura. And that's where you got all your information.
You worked at the shop, didn't you?
Oh, yeah. And well, that picture's all about that. You know, I worked there for a couple of summers off and on, between joints. I'd just go down and work a little bit. But my first summer there in '69, when that picture was taken, I worked there for, well, I don't know, 4 months. Also worked in Aspen cutting trails for Harvey Carter. Harvey and I are good friends. I skied there, skied in Vail. To Nepal. Because he was friends with Jimmy Roberts. You know, it's a pretty tight. See, in those days, it was a pretty tight world. We all knew one another. We all knew everything that was going on. You know, and that's why there was only 4 places you went, because maybe there was only 100, 200 climbers really that were doing anything that people would say that were impressive. You know, big walls like Bridwell and Schmidt and, you know, all those guys. Before that, Chuck Pratt and, you know, and Frank Sacher and Robbins, and everybody knew one another. Nowadays it's kind of hard to imagine that because there's so many climbers. But it wasn't really that far-fetched. When you went to Chamonix, and it was in the climbing season, the odds are if there was Americans in Chamonix, you were going to know you knew who they were. Or if they hadn't met them, they knew of you, so if one of their, so you could team up to go do a climb. Because sometimes somebody would get sick or they wouldn't fancy it, and you say, I want to go do this, and say, I want to go do the Père Buttress in Mont Blanc, and the guy say, I don't want to get anywhere near that, and then somebody will say, hey, I'll go, and off you go. I mean, that was the whole thing about climbing in the early days. It was switching partners like a square dance, It was really good. It was great. It's 1961, actually, summer of 61. And Paul Nunn was there, who ran Climbing Magazine, and Tall Paul, they called him. And his climbing partner did not want to go on to anything that had more than 1 pitch long or 2 pitches long, which is pretty hard to do. And Tall Paul wanted to do the Brandler Haas Direttissima, which Bonington and Willens had just made the first British ascent of. And I had just done the Kamichi route with my friend Con Higgins. Eventually climbed with Bonington later on and did King Cobra and Skye. But at that time, Con wasn't into really hard climbing. So Paul and I teamed up. And that's how it goes, And we send these other two to climb with each other, and we go and climb ourselves,
Is that the route you got up the route? The Lothar?
No, we didn't. We actually finished up on the Bullweg, which was the first true Direttissima on the Cima Grande, or the Dreizinnen, as they say in German. It's called the Bullweg, and it was just being put up, and it was absolutely, totally artificial from the ground to the very summit, over overhangs. And Paul and I climbed up there, having done almost no artificial climbing, homemade étriers or stirrups I made in the shipyards. And we made it up till we ran out of pitons, and then we looked at each other and said, there's no more pitons. And then we had to come down. And needless to say, it was an epic. But we were fine. We almost had to spend the night, but we never did. We got off in the mist, dark, the full extent of a rope, after about 16 rappels.
That's funny.
Reclimbing down what we had climbed up.
When did you meet Larry?
I met Larry in Lausanne, and I would say that was probably the first time I met Larry. It was in the bag about, it was probably just either before or after John Harlan got killed. It would be 66 probably, 65 or 66. Because he was around, and he had just climbed, and he was getting his climbing career started. And I was just busy in Lausanne, just basically climbing and skiing. And that's what Dougal and I did there, as we climbed and skied literally every day. We had off seasons, and that's when we partied, and a lot of the drinking stories come out of that. Where both of us got a reputation for being pretty wild. It wasn't every night for sure. It was maybe twice a year. But it seemed like it happened. But it didn't. We were too fit. We were too busy. A classic hike in Lausanne is up the Rion-Da, and from Rion-Da to Bernus, the Tour de Mayenne, Tour de Famelon, Tour d'Aille, Col de Moche, Chamoisser, along towards the Gunflue, down Les Diabrelais, swing round and come back over Champéry and Pic Chamoisser, back down and back up to Lausanne. 4-day hike, 5-day hike, just bivouacking and hiking and climbing.
That's quite a ways down to the Les de l'Arbre.
Well, yeah, but for us, when you're raised in Scotland and you're climbing in the bad weather, when you can't climb in Scotland, the conditions weren't good, you always had the off-season, and in the off-season, you went on what we called the big peak chanks. You just walked for 30, 40 miles and did Munros. That was how you stayed in shape, regardless of the weather, Because the only thing that stopped us was just weather, torrential downpours and snowstorms, but you could still walk, so we would just walk. Yeah. But one time,
so you and Dougal climbed up above on the rocks above town.
Yeah. Well, one time, I guess it would be in the early winter, December '65. Dougal and I were in de Boozman's house, who was this musician, and we decided we wanted to kind of start off doing some winter climbs, and one of the first ones we did was the Sphinx chimney, and we knew it hadn't been climbed in the winter because all the local people had told us it had never been done, and no one did any winter climbing. And in those days, as I say, we would post hole up most of the areas, you know, because most Brits couldn't ski. But at this time, I'd taught Dougal enough skiing that we could ski. So we took the teleferique up the Bernous with our skis and skied down to the little alpine, you know, cow cabin just right below the Tour d'Aille, the Sphinx and the buttresses and the faces there, and we spent the night there. And then the next day we just walked up and we climbed it, and it was pretty interesting because there we were, there was no skiers around, and we were up there on this face, and